Welcome to Secondary Cities, Primary Opportunities, a podcast which aims to highlight the significance of secondary cities and the issues that they face, emphasizing the value of smaller scale urbanization and regional growth. This is our very first episode. I am Monica Laucas, an economist at Bureau Appold, and I'm here today with my fellow hosts and Bureau Appold colleagues, Arturo Reyes, sustainability consultant.
Hello, hello.
And Paul Norman, environmental consultant.
Hello, good to be here.
We also have a very special guest today, Antonio Rovira, strategic planner at Bureau Appold, who will help us unpack the topic, define what secondary cities are, and some of the opportunities that they present. Welcome, Antonio.
Thank you.
So let's jump into it. What are secondary cities? Paul, could you help us define this for our listeners?
Yeah, sure. I mean, what's a secondary city to any sort of within any sort of country or place might vary a bit, and I guess we can come on to talk about that. But it can be quite useful to have a sort of general, I guess, sort of definition that we're kind of working with. And the Cities Alliance have defined what they think constitutes a secondary city. So I'll just read this out, and maybe we can kind of discuss it a bit and whether we think it fits. But they've said a secondary city is one that falls outside the primary urban core of the country, often characterized by population size, administrative importance, economic function, and geographic location. Secondary cities, they say, typically have populations ranging from 100,000 to 500,000 people, although this can vary significantly depending on the country's context. And finally, it says there's cities that play crucial roles in regional and national development, acting as hubs for local economies and providing essential services and linkages between rural areas and larger metropolitan regions. So, I mean, what do people think of that? I'll give my kind of thoughts first, but it'd be good to kind of hear what others think, if they agree, and kind of if there's anything they think is missing before we kind of dig into it further and discuss the issues that they face. I think to begin with, I think it recognizes that cities of this type are crucial, but they're often kind of overlooked components of regional and national development. And, it's important to note that I think, a significant portion of the world's population live in secondary cities, but they are often neglected by decision makers, governments, and often get much less funding allocation. Mm-hmm. And I think just going one other thing in terms of the population size and the role in connecting rural and primary urban areas, I think it's helpful, but I think there's more to it than that. And, there are kind of economic, cultural, and historical nuances about secondary cities that are often maybe kind of common between them, that characterize them. And these are things that we're going to be kind of digging into, unpacking, and looking at more in the podcast series as a whole. But I think it is a useful definition.
Yeah, I think you're totally right. About 75% of the world's population actually resides in cities that have less than 500,000 inhabitants, but the majority of the focus goes on mega projects and capital cities. So it's really important to start thinking about the smaller urban settlements as well. But at the same time, we can't group them into this category. Each country and each city is very different.
Yeah, it's a good point, and the definition sort of noted and pointed out that it's not like a strict guide for every nation, and while it may fit, maybe that kind of size fits many of the sort of developed countries, it's essentially scalable. And I think, for example, what constitutes a secondary city here in the UK, where we are sitting recording this, is maybe is going to be very different to what would be a secondary city in, India and China or.
And also, I think it's important to point out that the motivation behind this podcast came from our SILA project, which is the initiative that Bureau Appold is promoting. It's an internal think tank. And then for Monica, Paul, and myself, we are from secondary cities, and that was the motor behind the development of this podcast and the selection of our topics, because we are from smaller towns and Hawick and the Scottish Borders for Paul.
Hoik.
And Hoik.
Yeah.
Yes,
Look, you
terrible
spell
at
it Hawick, by the way. Yeah,
pronunciation.
Hoik. Yeah.
Exactly. And then Kalasca in Piemonte in Italy for Monica.
Yes.
And then I'm from Ciudad Guzman, Jalisco in Mexico. So they're very different contexts, but they're all secondary cities in the context of our own countries. And I think we recognize that there are challenges that come with it, but also lots of opportunities. So I think we are keen to explore that in this podcast series. And
Yeah.
Antonio, what would you
No, I
think
agree.
about this?
I agree. I think as a definition, it does capture, it puts the focus on what we want to analyze, which is, well, it's secondary cities. I prefer to call them intermediary cities because secondary, first of all, they position them as second, but sometimes they are third, fourth, fifth in terms of population size or even the role they play. So it's for me, it's more intermediary cities, and they are basically the urban settlements that fall in the urban hierarchy between the primary cities and the very rural areas. Is all that kind of rural urban spectrum or hierarchy that intermediary cities fall into. The definition doesn't really talk about the importance that much, although I think they are absolutely critical, and I think we will go into that in a bit, but it just defines them, very broadly. And as it's been said before, it's not just about population, although the ones that tend to be more important are also the ones that are capturing fast growing population on one part of the world, or others that are having a very extreme decline, which are also problematic sometimes. And I think a last thing I would like to say is that this fits very much with local economic development and how do we achieve a more balanced territorial distribution of development or of growth, rather than, and this is a global trend of growth being completely agglomerated in one urban center or two urban centers. And that is a global trend apart from a few countries. And that is partly because of a shift in the economy, but also because of the policies focused mainly on primary cities and not intermediary cities. And I think that in itself is problematic. And I think secondary cities, as we've said, they hold the key to trying to balance this territorial development or achieving a more territorial equity. So I think that's what we would like to discuss about. How do we achieve that?
Yes, absolutely. That is the focus of what we want to unpack as well. It's how do we equally distribute growth, wealth, and also support the areas to develop. It's a really important point.
They face very different challenges as well. And I think that's something that potentially is not captured on the definition, although I don't think I think it is important to have a broad definition. They are very, very different. Intermediary cities in Sub-Saharan Africa, they are extremely important for a very different reason than intermediary cities in, for example, in Europe, right? That's quite clear. But overall, all intermediary cities, I think, are absolutely crucial when we look at regional development and territorial development, territorial equity. So from one, on one direction or another, I think it is important to kind of put the focus on those settlements.
Mm-hmm.
I think the sort of fallacy of, in this case, of a kind of one size fits all is really important to note. And although secondary cities often have quite different challenges, there are also sort of common ones that many of them might have. But even where there are kind of similar issues they're facing, it's the solution. It's not like you can find a solution that's going to work for all of the cities that are facing, cultural decline or economic sort of impacts and things. And depending on the location and the demographics and how close they are to kind of other cities and things, I think the solutions are going to be very different.
Antonio, you've written a very interesting article about this topic on intermediary cities and the barriers that they face on spatial planning implementation, focusing on Kenya specifically. Could you tell us a bit more about it and why effective planning on this scale would be crucial for wider regional development?
Yes, absolutely. Even if I've mentioned intermediary cities in Europe and the developed world, to be honest, I am not really that acquainted with their issues. I know that they face population decline due to over agglomeration of economic activity in primary cities. But I am, I've focused my research and my interest in intermediary cities in Sub-Saharan Africa and particularly in Kenya and East Africa. The paper is called Barriers to, or From Plan to Action, Barriers to Implementing Spatial Planning in Sub-Saharan Africa, in intermediary cities of Sub-Saharan Africa. Is a very long title. But essentially what we looked at is that there is a lot of of recognition that secondary cities need to be, the growth of secondary cities in Sub-Saharan Africa needs to be managed. A lot of them don't even have a name. They used to, like 5 years ago, was only a market in a crossroad, and now, they have more than 250,000 people, and it doesn't even have a name or even like a municipal boundary. That is problematic because, as we know, if it grows informally, it is going to be very, very hard to retrofit or make sustainable, or even achieving certain levels of basic rights or basic services to the population once that population has been established and it has reached a certain population number. So spatial planning becomes absolutely fundamental once you see that some of those cities, in intermediary cities, are growing exponentially. And this is a trend throughout Sub-Saharan Africa because they still have a big urban-rural transition. And that transition is often not possible, like it's not from the rural to the primary cities because the cost of migration is high. So the intermediary cities, first of all, they reduce the cost of migration. So it's the first kind of step in the urban-rural migration cycle, let's say. And that is why in populations where agriculture is very prominent economically, and there is a shift towards a more service-oriented or an increase in purchasing power or development, which is normally accompanied by rural urban migration, although there is also some push factors that we can talk about, such as like climate change. But if we talk about the pull factors towards cities, is mainly like an increase in access to services, education and health, and also higher wages. So just talking about those push factors in Sub-Saharan Africa and in communities that are reliant on agriculture but are facing this transition, there is a huge growth overall of intermediary cities, and the paper looked at the how hard it is for them to implement planning. Because first of all, they lack resources much more than primary cities, and primary cities struggle to implement planning themselves, and it's only one city with one municipality with most of the resources. Now imagine doing that for, I don't know, hundreds or even thousands of small municipalities that are growing really fast. They have like a fraction of the resources, a fraction of the capabilities. They find it really hard to attract talent, although sometimes they do have it, but some others, like really it's really hard for them to attract the right talent to manage that. They lack a legal framework for implementation. So even though they do invest in urban planning, they can't implement it. And that is actually very frustrating because they spend a lot of money on developing plans that are not implemented. And in order to approve a plan, you go through a consultation. So that creates a lot of frustration from the public towards the political elite, who, first of all, they're already reticent to invest in planning because it's not tangible. It's a document, but it's nothing tangible that they can show to their voters. So every time if they invest in planning, you finally convince them that planning is important. They invest in developing a plan and then it's completely unimplementable. So it's a completely waste of money. And that kind of creates a vicious cycle against planning because people don't lose their faith on what planning is. The politicians don't see the value of it, so they don't invest on it. So eventually planning doesn't happen. And once that is in place, it's very hard to revert. So it is very important to focus not only on developing the plan, but actually how do we implement it and how do we help those cities manage their growth effectively through planning implementation.
Can I ask a quick question on that kind of legal side? I know there's other kind of barriers and things you've looked at. So you're saying like plans can be developed, but then the process kind of falls apart because there's not a legal sort of framework there. Is that the difference then between a sort of regional aims or ambitions and a kind of who's proposing that kind of city plan or things, or is it kind of local plans, and is it at a national level there isn't the legal framework to kind of uphold that?
The paper focuses on Kenya, who has,
Yeah.
which is a country that has seen like a very strong and kind of abrupt devolution cycle. So a lot of the competencies, the legal competencies for planning, or
Right.
actually the whole planning department has been devolved to the new regions, the counties, the 43 new counties. But this devolution, even though it was like really big, it was voted in very eagerly by the population, and it held quite a lot of expectations. That was in 2010, and what we've seen is that is what we call unfunded mandates. So there has been a big devolution, and we're talking about planning here. So it's obviously the devolution doesn't only talk about planning, but the planning has been very much devolved. But the resources in order to develop a legal framework for each county and implement that new planning framework has not been accompanied. So most of the counties, they don't, even though they are mandated by the constitution to implement to develop a plan at the county level and then town plans for each of their towns, which will help them manage growth. And that it's a constitutional mandate. So planning is actually is at the essence of the new constitution, really. But they are unable to implement it because they lack funding. So, they are facing what we call unfunded mandates. They have a mandate to do something, but they don't have the resources.
Right.
But the barriers go beyond the resources of like, oh, we don't have enough funding, or we don't have enough capabilities, or we don't have enough resources such as like computers or GIS accessibility. It goes even beyond that, and I think that is I think what the paper, the value of the paper, that it looks at also the cultural challenges that secondary cities face to implement planning, because a lot of those, because they are the first point of migration, there is a lot of ethnic cultural practices around land that make it really hard to plan, because the ownership is not clear. It's very communal. A lot of the times it's communal land. A lot of the times it's not. No one knows who it belongs to. But also, so a lot of the cultures they have untangible value to land, because they bury their debts over generations in that land, or for whatever other reason. So you can't. So implementing planning in a normal, or the way we understand it, which is like, okay, we have ownership and then we develop. Or we buy land at a certain market price, is harder, because there is a lot more tensions around cultural land practices that make land to achieve a value that is untangible. So those barriers are actually a lot harder to overcome than actually providing more resources for planners to be there, which is actually step one, right? But the challenges are actually a lot deeper.
Have you seen any examples of how communities have overcome those challenges at that level? Because I understand that maybe we are trying to implement those very kind of Occidental ways of managing planning, when exactly as you said, it's just you make the plan, you implement it, that's it. But do you think there's a way where we can work with communities to start planning from their core principles and beliefs and diversity?
I don't know if I can pinpoint to a specific example. I do know what the literature around planning. There is a huge amount of literature on like Occident, or like neo-colonialism through planning, right? Or a continuation of colonialism through planning practices. And to be honest, most of the current planning practices are from the colonial era, the British colonial era in Kenya. There is the Town Planning Act of 1960 or something like that, that still rules planning in Kenya. So overcoming that is very hard, and we know that institutions are very kind of path dependent and very sticky and hard to change. So when you're talking about practices that have been applied since the beginning of the century, so changing that is very, very hard. So what I mean is, even though there is a lot of criticism towards this kind of or what they call neo-colonialism through planning, I think the reality is that the alternative is just not there. Like, what would be a non-colonial way of planning is just something that cannot be thought, even, because their only way of thinking about it is through what they know, which is colonial planning. But having said that, there is an opportunity to actually broaden our horizons in terms of how can we work to the communities to plan in a way that is kind of more respectful, or at least that they acknowledges the intangibility of land that certain cultures may have. And I think that is very much possible. I don't think it's like, I mean, of course, through consultation, but I think it's about like the recognition that they have certain well, first that they have the right over the land. That's the first thing. Sometimes that it doesn't even happen. But then, and after that is trying to acknowledge that, and not trying to force it. However, in a capitalistic society, even if we acknowledge that, the market value of land might prevail eventually. And that is not because the planning is forcing them to do so. It's because once they have a legal tenure to land and they are the rightful owners, private developers might contact them directly, and they, to develop their land. And if it goes on in the same direction as what is permitted through the planning process, then they will be able to do it. And that's, I mean, in my opinion, and that's completely fine, as long as we accept that as long as we accept that they might not want to do that, but giving them the right to do so if they want to.
When you started speaking, you spoke about these places that often, in some cases, recently or even still might not even kind of have formal names. They've gone from, a very kind of minor collection of houses to these sort of cities of 100-odd thousand. What effects that having on? I know our focus is secondary cities, but if they're coming from rural areas, what effects that having on rural areas, or is it kind of coming from what would be sort of subsidiary kind of farming and things, and it's not having a sort of national effect on agriculture or things? But yeah, I mean, it seems like huge numbers that obviously are moving to these secondary cities.
Well, I think first of all, that's a fascinating research question for a PhD. I would definitely consider, because it is fascinating to see what is the effect on agricultural productivity of that. I know that there is some research that is very, very fascinating. I mean, especially one paper by Professor Vernon in 2017, who looks at the effect of climate change on urbanization, and it looks at the humidity of changes in the humidity of soil and correlates that to patterns of urbanization or rapid urbanization of peri-urban areas or kind of intermediary cities, and he finds a significant relationship. Probably causality still, I mean, even though he uses advanced techniques, you can still challenge the causality, but there is a very strong relationship between climate change and urbanization. So there is pull factors that are affecting this trend of like growth of intermediary cities, but it's also accompanied by a huge youth sprawl that Sub-Saharan Africa is seeing at the moment. Potentially the last one, I would say, right, according to like global trends. So and just potentially not enough, or either not enough employment opportunities in the agriculture, very kind of insecure ways of living, or related to agriculture, and also an increased opportunities in the urban areas. I think for me that will be all the factors that affect it. What is fascinating about your question is to understand what is happening in the agriculture sector itself, apart from climate change. Like what is happening? Is it really because there is a shift? There is a huge shift from agriculture to services or even industrialization in urban areas, which is kind of like the traditional way of urbanization, right? I mean, urbanizations have always been pegged with industrialization and growth, but there is also this theory now about like urbanization without growth, which is kind of driven by things that are not. It's not because they had industrialization. It's not because they have like higher income per capita. There is no growth yet. Urbanization is happening. So what are those causes? Maybe fertility rates are very high. Like we know that fertility rates in urban areas, in agriculture areas are higher than in urban areas. So it might be a lag. So people that move from agriculture areas into intermediary cities might still have high fertility rates, which makes the natural growth of the city grow exponentially. It might be that there is just a lot of young people that just don't want to live they don't want to stay in agricultural areas and want to find new opportunities in urban areas. again, fascinating thing to see whether the migration is mainly young people looking for opportunities, or is it just full families, or it will be the characteristics of the migrants that are driving the growth of those cities is a fascinating topic as well.
Mm-hmm.
And it's one of the reasons that in the podcast series, we're actually looking at different dissected topics in each episode. So we're going to look at precisely migration on also the different lenses that it can have on conflict, on climate change, on regular patterns of cities, and how everything is interconnected. But we're also planning to see how cultural interventions are actually shaping cities in other regions. We do understand that this is such a vast topic that it impacts so many people around the world. But I think our goal with the podcast is start shining some light on the different aspects that interact here, and just kind of start asking questions to see where we can take the conversation further.
I think especially for cities that are growing rapidly and the growth is unplanned, climate resilience is not built into the development of the buildings and the new neighborhoods that are sprawling. So that is definitely something very important that we will cover in the podcast, and also because it just has knock-on effects on vulnerable communities that are most likely to suffer from these.
I was just going to ask, your kind of case studies and where you've been looking at your research, Antonio, is in some communities in Kenya. But to what extent do you think the same patterns that you're seeing there of this kind of rural to these intermediary cities, then, perhaps onward, and that kind of hierarchy is mirrored across either, kind of broader Sub-Saharan Africa or even elsewhere, kind of globally?
Yes, I think it has a lot to do with the demographic composition and also the nature of the development, the nature of the economy. I think if we start comparing there is many other things, of course, but if we look at that as the basis, as the foundation, I think if we looked at other Sub-Saharan Africa countries that are very agricultural based and that are experiencing climate change and a youth purge, we will see similar patterns of growth in intermediary cities. That's what I think. However, there is also the legal framework, the institutional capacity of the country, and potentially even the colonial legacy. That we've seen some papers that prove that there is some that depending on the colonial legacy or what part of the colonization the country, or who were they colonized by affects the development, their capacity to implement planning, for example. So that might be another factor. But I think if we look at the economic characteristics of the country as well as the demographics, we will probably see similar characteristics, at least in Sub-Saharan Africa. I don't have the research for example, China or even Latin America. But I think, especially in terms of agriculture, if we start adding industrialization and we start adding different other development patterns, then the patterns of urbanization will change, I think.
Mm-hmm. I think definitely for China, it's a completely different story from Sub-Saharan Africa, where the pull factors from the magnet main cities like Shanghai, Beijing, that have been attracting for decades people to work in factories. But that has been changing recently with the cost of living and also the decrease in population growth rates in the country, with residents now starting to move, and in very big companies starting to move to slightly smaller cities, which of course in the context of China, a secondary city is still around 3 million inhabitants, which is very different from what we would see in Europe or probably even in Sub-Saharan Africa.
China is a fascinating as well area of research. Definitely not my expertise, but I think there also in China there is a lot of policy, like hard policy that alters the patterns of urbanization, both in terms of like huge investment in urban development, but also in terms of limiting migration. I think there are some, again, not an expert, but I think there are some limitations on how much you can migrate from city to city. So the institution, well, I would say that the government intervention in terms of managing migration is quite high compared to other countries. So I guess the patterns will be completely different from some Sub-Saharan Africa, which is the opposite. It's like a complete lack of any kind of policy to manage urban growth.
Yeah, they have internal visas that limit the number of years that people can remain in a certain city in China. I think in your research, did you identify any patterns in the sense of secondary or intermediary cities being a temporary stop for rural migrants to then wanting to go to a bigger city?
No, I have not done the research, although again, another big tick on a super interesting topic. But I am pretty certain that that's the case. I think the cost of migration, I think there is, it's what defines the migration of the flows and intensity of migration we're talking about internal migration here. Normally, it is very hard for someone living in a rural area to move directly to Nairobi, unless they are intermediary city right next to Nairobi. So obviously the distance is another key factor. But distance is also a cost of migration. So the farther you are, the higher the cost of migration. The closer you are, that reduces the cost of migration. Also, having people from your same ethnic or even area, because ethnicity is very spatial in Kenya because of the colonial heritage and the way the boundaries were drawn. So the counties are very much a majority of one ethnic group still now. So having diasporas of your own ethnic group within a major city and how big that diaspora is can increase or decrease your cost of migration, because if you know that your uncle is already there, then it's easier for you to go there and get help and to get settled. If you don't know anyone, your cost of migration increases. So there's more kind of the internal diasporas within cities that can also impact that. But I would say that intermediary cities are stepping stones of migration, I would say, and based on proximity.
Which I think fits into, I think we can draw similarities in the Latin American context and the United States, Canada, how even though it's not internal migration, Mexico, because of all the political context in the States, has started decreasing the amount of migrants that it receives because all the restrictions. Then countries like Mexico started inadvertently receiving migrants from then Central South American countries that start establishing there because they don't have other options. And then it's all this kind of unexpected outcomes that you see. But then you start seeing all that unplanned growth, lack of regulation, and kind of similar problems. But then when we compare to Europe, you have all these policies in place, all these massive planning restrictions and regulations. But we can see also that there's such a thing as over planning and over restriction, and like just making it very difficult to actually plan a city where everyone can be part of the solution, rather than just, this is prescriptive, this is what we do, this is what's been proven, but then it comes with other issues as well. So I think it's just very interesting.
Absolutely. I don't know, it will be interesting to see how much solutions to that have been explored, because I think thinking that we're going to be, that planning can happen quick, or the implementation of planning can happen fast enough to caught up with the rate of urbanization of intermediary cities is a dream. It will never happen. So how much are we exploring retrofitting planning to unplanned urban areas, right? I mean, and I think that is the absolute key, because we are already late for most of them, and we are definitely late for the future growth as well, because we are just incapable of planning. So how do we do that retrospectively? How do we bring like infrastructure to an already organic city that has grown without any sort of planning? That would be probably something very a lot more pragmatic, less theoretical, but very interesting to explore.
Yeah, I think there are some examples in slums in Latin America, Brazil, some even in Mexico, where it's more like surgical interventions that start regenerating those very, very, very complex areas, favelas and communities that have just intertwined, and then the access is impossible almost. But you start seeing kind of interesting projects emerging here and there. The case of Colombia as well. I think there's some exciting case studies there as well.
But can we do that at scale, right, to have an impact. Because I mean, and that happens a lot with all these kind of planning and sustainable urban development projects. And I think it's something that I've actually talked a lot about in the past, which is that all the kind of best practice on sustainable urban development are also a dream. For every kind of King's Cross project, we have like 2,000 very unsustainable urban development projects. So, how do we need to be rethinking or kind of trying to like be a bit more realistic about what can be achieved and what matters, rather than trying to achieve everything and being perfect, right? And I think the current frameworks for sustainable urban development projects are a bit idealistic and unimplementable. And when we take that, I mean, it's unimplementable even in the UK. So imagine in Africa. So if we bring those to say like, look, if you really want to implement a plan, and I think that's something that we also talk about on the article, is like they are trying to say, oh, we've been like super thorough with all the consultation that we've done, because that's what the best practice in terms of like developing a special plan tell you to do. The UN or any other international organizations will tell them, no, consultation is absolutely key. Yeah, but the cost of like consultation of everyone in a context like Africa and intermediary cities, and the monetary cost, but also the time cost of doing that, might be completely counterproductive. So, I mean, is it really? Can we not? I mean, they are currently just implementing exactly what they are advising? But to be honest, that advice doesn't even work in developed countries. So, I think we need to challenge that, especially in the context of intermediary cities in Sub-Saharan Africa.
I think that's a very interesting point, because we're all based in the UK, and we know how frustrating sometimes it can be to work in the planning sector. You're working on a very interesting project, but by the time it goes through all of the consultation and environmental impact assessment and planning, it might end up passing over 10 years. So and by the time it gets approved, it's almost superseded, and you have to rethink it.
In that sense, do you think, is there like either a danger or risk, a completely different mindset, that if we're trying to tackle the opportunities there, we can't just apply the principles and things we think of when we're looking at UK or European, these sorts of cities? Or do you think there are some things that be applicable or that could help out within these?
Yeah, we were thinking about that for a different project, which again we were criticizing a bit idealistic kind of practical guides to urban development, that developed by the UN. And look, is it like a friendly criticism? I mean, they've done an amazing job trying to identifying what matters, and they've done a great job at doing that. What they haven't done as well, I think, and I think is something still to be done, and I think is the most useful thing, is identifying the trade-offs. Is what matters, for each project. But a lot of them is they're common trade-offs, and those trade-offs, they tend to kind of follow the project throughout. So when you're trying to redevelop an area or like an existing unplanned urban area, you're going to be facing some very strong trade-offs, and those are probably common to most of the other urban areas. And understanding those trade-offs and making a decision about those trade-offs and understanding them, I think already puts you in a better position. And I think even in the UK, I think sometimes we need to start thinking that we can't do everything, we can't get everything right, and we shouldn't. We just need to we shouldn't, because we can't afford it. That not even in the UK we can afford to implement everything that is on the guidebook of sustainable urban development, right? This is just not affordable. So we need to understand, and the consequence of that is being very unsustainable, really, because it's not applicable, which means that most of the urban developments are just not sustainable at all. So can we not find like a middle point where we say, okay, what truly matters? And what can we afford that truly matters for sustainability for this particular project? And that is about understanding what are the trade-offs and making pragmatic decisions based on what can be affordable, so we can actually scale up our interventions and do it not for one, but almost for every single urban development that we manage to plan and implement, right? And I think for Sub-Saharan Africa is the same kind of argument. It's not for the public officials to take a UN practical guide to urban planning and then just like unpacking it and applying it exactly like that to plan an intermediary city in Kenya, for example, because that really doesn't work, and it leads to frustration and a vicious cycle of like mistrust on planning. I think what they need to do is understanding, okay, what's the best we can do, and what truly matters, what the success looks like for us that we can afford, and then focus on that. That's better. I mean, is this idea of let's not make the best being an enemy of something good.
And you've had to work on this a lot in projects that had to do with restructuring after disasters as well, which means having to make decisions very fast.
Yes, that's the project I was referring to. Is the reconstruction of the city of Antakya in Turkey after the earthquake in 2023, and I think what we've learned through doing that is again like some similarities in terms of we were working with the municipality and an NGO that was pushing the reconstruction efforts, and we saw the process of like how do they deal with such a vast task of like planning the reconstruction, and I think what we picked up is that what matters the most is to set from the beginning what are the key success principles, what matters for the project, what do we want to achieve, and then trying to understand what are going to be the key trade-offs that are going to be accompanying the project. And some of them were okay, we're building back, but we need to build back better. So we're not building for the currently displaced population and to build exactly what was, but trying to use this opportunity to improve the city and make it more sustainable. Trying to prioritize investment, which is what we just been discussing about, is okay, well, we don't have unlimited resources. So where do we start? Where do we focus our efforts in order to have to increase the impact, right? In order to achieve the success principles. And the last one, I think this one is less relevant for intermediary cities, depending on the context though, is this, displaced population and how fast can we build to bring back the currently displaced population as soon as possible. I mean, on the city, we were looking at close to 300,000 people currently displaced and without a house. So building the number of units required for them to come back is a challenge in itself. And what we were exploring is what happens if you don't, because it is very likely that within the window of opportunity for them to come back, which is around 10 years, after that they might have moved on. You're not targeting them anymore. What happens if you don't bring back 100% of the people that are currently displaced, right? What's the impact on the economy? I mean, what's the impact on the expectations of the city, on its competitiveness, etc. But those were the questions, that the three kind of main questions that we were looking into, and I think they have an echo on intermediary cities in terms of let's be a bit more pragmatic and to be honest, some people have been doing that. There is such a thing as emergency planning, which actually looks at not following the key guidelines and being a lot more pragmatic about or more kind of outcome oriented when it comes to planning. So this is something that is super interesting, and I think it should be developed even further, almost as a practical guide to be implemented across Sub-Saharan Africa to a certain extent.
Mm-hmm. Almost using the emergency planning framework as a guide to local planning development, so that you're merging the two and trying to respond to reality more quickly.
Absolutely.
Because especially on work on sustainability at a building scale, we're talking about circular economy and how flexibility, adaptability need to be integrated into specific projects. But I think it's totally scalable to the planning level to see, maybe we don't need to be so strict on this section is for commerce, this section is for housing. Like we should be more flexible in just adapting, because we're just facing change at a rate that we haven't seen before, so we need to start thinking about that.
Yeah. And that's another key question. How flexible do we make the planning system? Is it very rigid and spatial, like in some European countries, or is it less prescriptive and more kind of based on negotiation, like in the UK context? They both have like pros and cons, and again, at the moment, they're probably going for the more of a British model in Kenya due to their colonial heritage, but. Yeah, I mean, it is a complex thing, but we don't really, trying to anticipate the consequences of doing one or the other is going to be quite hard.
That, I guess, brings us towards the closing of our episode. So, Antonio, one of our traditions for this series would be to ask our speakers one or two changes that they would like to see in secondary cities. So, based on our discussion, what would you say are yours?
I think it would be to see a lot more capabilities in terms of planning implementation for intermediary cities, and I really serious investment in achieving planning implementation. So not just development of an amazing plan, but actually focusing on managing growth through planning, which is planning implementation essentially, both at the level of the county, so the regional level, and cascading down into the local towns.
That's great. Thanks very much. So Arturo, Paul, what do you think? Can we give a sneak peek of what's coming in the podcast series to our listeners?
Yes, so we are going to have a diversity of topics. We're going to have an episode on migration, as mentioned, looking at all these different lenses that we can have. And then Paul.
Yeah, one of our episodes where we're going to be recording soon is a really interesting discussion about the role that culture in the context of kind of arts and culture can play in regenerating cities and bringing communities together and giving identity back maybe to cities that have lost it or need a bit of a kind of catalyst for some growth, so that culture can be a kind of key driver.
And of course, we're going to talk about climate resilience, climate change, and how that's going to impact secondary cities as well. So we have quite an exciting set of a series coming.
Yeah. Well, thanks very much for listening to this, and thanks very much, Antonio, for being here with us. It was a pleasure speaking with you.
My pleasure. Thank you.
Pleasure, Antonio. Thank you.